Sports Tonight with Fred and Vince, 11 Eastern on CNN.
Hello, this is Ralph Begleiter at the Pentagon. As much as any event during the Cold War, the Vietnam War has shaped the behavior of the United States at the end of the 20th century. Long after the last body bags and POWs returned from Southeast Asia, Vietnam still affects the very basis on which Washington makes decisions to exercise American power. In this edition of CNN's Cold War Postscript, we'll see that Cold War legacy in places as diverse as Bosnia, Somalia, and the Persian Gulf. Some of the men and women who served in Vietnam are now leaders here at the Pentagon and across the Potomac River on Capitol Hill. What they experienced during the war and after returning home still affects their decisions about war and peace today. We have two reports from the Defense Department and Capitol Hill.
I'm Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon. The Vietnam War was a bloody gut check for the U.S. military. On paper, American forces never lost a battle, but the more than 58,000 deaths and the anti-war protests they sparked were a defeat for the Pentagon at home. It led to what some have called the Vietnam Syndrome, a generation of American military leaders reluctant to put U.S. troops in harm's way without a clear, winnable mission.
2 years of my life were spent in Vietnam, and I came away from that experience with a belief that if we're going to send young men and women into harm's way, we should make sure they have a clear purpose that they are fighting for. They understand that purpose. The American people understand it, and the American people are supporting them in what they do.
That reluctance didn't keep troops out of the crossfire for long. Beirut, Lebanon, 1983, 10 years after Vietnam. 241 Marines fall victim to a truck bomb attack while on an ambiguous mission. It moves Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger to declare the U.S. should commit its troops only with vital U.S. interests at stake.
So let no one entertain any illusions. If our vital interests are involved, we are prepared to fight. And because we are prepared to fight, we believe we will not have to. And we're resolved, however, that if we must fight, we must win.
It was a standard that fit the Persian Gulf War, but which policymakers found too inflexible to deal with other post-Cold War threats. The problem with an all-or-nothing approach to the use of force is that it leaves the U.S. no option to back diplomacy with military muscle. The State Department wanted the military to combat other threats, such as famine, human rights abuses, weapons proliferation, drug trafficking, and terrorism. But first, a lesson of Vietnam would have to be relearned. Somalia, October 3rd, 1993. In the deadliest firefight since Vietnam, 18 Army Rangers are killed in Mogadishu. The American public was shocked by images like these. Congress questioned how a humanitarian mission to feed the hungry had turned into a shooting war.
Get a bill!
Then Defense Secretary William Perry laid down his rules for coercive diplomacy, using military force in limited missions to advance limited diplomatic goals, such as peacekeeping.
The role that the U.S. would play would be the role that where we have something unique to bring.
All right, the rules of engagement are a little more restrictive than they were.
Today, there's almost an obsession with preventing combat deaths. In Bosnia, for example, U.S. troops patrol in convoys wearing body armor, while other NATO troops can hang out with locals. U.S. commanders now know they must meet a zero-casualty threshold. It's why the rescue of Air Force Captain Scott O'Grady, shot down over Bosnia in 1996, may have saved the Bosnia mission. And it's why, since the Cold War, the unmanned cruise missile has become America's weapon of choice against terrorists and dictators. Jamie McIntyre, CNN, The Pentagon.
This is Candy Crowley on Capitol Hill. Even now, the echoes of Vietnam speak to a generation of Americans, be it Bosnia,
Mike Durant,
or Somalia, Kosovo, or the Persian Gulf. The questions not asked in Vietnam are asked now. Few need to hear the answers as much as those who came home and now decide when others must go. Former Army Captain Max Cleland lost both legs and an arm in Khe Sanh. Now, on Kosovo, Senator Cleland asks, can we make a difference?
All I learned in terms of the Vietnam experience, all that I'm aware of, indicates my reluctance to use military force across an internationally recognized boundary to try to manage or micromanage a civil war between ethnic groups.
Bob Smith, a Navy E-4, served in the Gulf of Tonkin. When war was imminent in the Persian Gulf, Senator Smith wanted to know, can we be quick and be gone?
I asked President Bush point blank, I said, look, I'm not going to support this unless you can tell me that this is not another Vietnam, that we are going to go in and we are going to go out and get the job done. And he looked me right in the eye and said, I can assure you it won't be another Vietnam. So, and he kept his word.
Army Sergeant Chuck Hagel was wounded twice in the Mekong Delta.
In the wake of mortar fire and bombs, the landing parties moved towards the jungle hideouts of the Viet Cong.
Nebraska Senator Hagel on any military action involving U.S. troops. If we go, are we going with all we've got?
There are things worth fighting for and worth dying for. Then we have to acknowledge that and deal with that. And I subscribe to the Colin-Powell theory of warfare, and that is if you're going to engage with everything you have, with all the immense power we can bring to bear to protect that man or that woman down on the ground.
More than 50,000 Americans died in Vietnam. Those lucky enough to come home were left with a legacy of questions. Navy pilot John McCain was a prisoner of war for 5 years.
But when I left Vietnam, I put it behind me. In other words, I never had a flashback, I never had a nightmare, etc. Now, on foreign policy issues, Bosnia, Middle East, Iraq, certainly the shadow of Vietnam does fall on me.
The shadow of Vietnam. Why are we going? Can we succeed? Will we give it everything we have? When can we come home? Is this another Vietnam? Candy Crowley, CNN, Capitol Hill.
Cold War discussion is presented by Unisys. When it comes to information services and technology, we eat, sleep, and drink this stuff. And by the Archer Daniels Midland Company, ADM, supermarket to the world.
At Unisys, we don't stop thinking about a client's problem until it's solved. Even now, this guy is developing a system that'll dramatically increase Delta Airlines' cargo efficiency.
Are you going to putt or just admire the green?
Solving problems this way isn't unusual for us.
I've got it.
In fact, it's par for the course. Unisys. We eat, sleep, and drink this stuff.
The best things in life just come naturally, like the natural vitamin E that ADM makes from soybeans. Now available in many leading brands of dietary supplements, it can help you maintain cardiovascular health, a good cholesterol level, and maybe even help you feel younger longer. Natural vitamin E from ADM. Do what comes naturally.
The everyday struggle of getting from here to there without losing anything along the way. Consider sending over 2 trillion bits of information from here to there with only 1 bit of error possible in every quadrillion bits. Remember, in today's business world, as in life, the lead dog always has the best view.
Welcome back to CNN's Cold War Postscript. We're here at the museum in Arlington, Virginia. Joining me now to continue our look at the role Vietnam played during the Cold War are 3 scholars of that era. They are Stanley Carnot, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist whose book on Vietnam has sold 1.5 million copies. Mr. Carnot reported on the Vietnam War from July 1959 until its conclusion. Tom Blanton, executive director of the National Security Archive, a group that's pushed for the declassification of thousands of government documents on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Vladislav Zubak, a fellow at the National Security Archive, is considered one of the leading Russian historians of the Cold War. Stanley Carnot, has the United States yet overcome its Vietnam syndrome, its fear of mission creep or escalation, as it's called then?
I don't like the word syndrome because it implies some sort of a mental disorder. I think the term was first used by Brzezinski in the sense that our hands are tied by the experience of Vietnam. From my perspective, what Vietnam has left is it's left in the American public this feeling that we have to ask questions about what we're getting involved in. When you go back and you look at Kennedy's inaugural, he says, we will support any friend, oppose any foe. The public didn't know what it meant. I mean, he said, okay, here's a blank check. Go ahead, do what you want. Vietnam has taught us that we cannot trust our leadership, and we have to ask questions. And the effect it's had today, of course, is that politicians and leaders are very sensitive to what public opinion is. You don't go into a new situation today without thinking about what public opinion feels about it, and therefore it's a constraint. So the silver lining, if you want, to the terrible tragedy of Vietnam is that we're much more conscious of where our leaders are taking us. Of course, we paid a very high tuition fee to learn this lesson.
It can be taken a step too far, and with hindsight, we can look at what happened in Bosnia, where I think the military, as opposed to the American public, learned the lesson of Vietnam maybe too much and ruled out at the very beginning of that breakdown of that country even limited airstrikes, which later on proved to be so effective at forcing the sides to the negotiating table. So I think there is a possibility of overlearning that lesson, but I do agree it's an incredibly salutary lesson.
If you go beyond Bosnia and think about Rwanda, or even think about the Gulf War, when there was a lot of talk about mission creep and escalation and slippery slopes and all that, do you border on having your hands tied, as Stanley was?
No, I think that a democracy has to go through this process of mobilizing public opinion and asking questions with great skepticism. That is a great lesson. All you have to do is look at the Russian experience in Chechnya to see what happens when you don't ask the questions and you don't learn the lesson.
That's what I want to add on. You Americans are really lucky to have a democratic movement, and that democratic movement about Vietnam was mobilized by television, by the exposure of those war atrocities to the scrutiny of the public. We never had this privilege in the Soviet Union. The war in Afghanistan was a secret war. We could only listen to foreign broadcasting to learn about the other side or about the war as such.
Even the casualties were
Even the casualties were not reported. Only mothers got their kids in boxes. So as a result, I don't think Russian society learned the lesson of Afghanistan, and that played a role 8 years later under similar circumstances, terrain, and even similar kind of foe was present. Russia unleashed the war in Chechnya, and unfortunately, again, no democratic protest emerged.
You mentioned the television war. Vietnam was a television war. Has that part of the Cold War, has that changed the way business is conducted today?
That's part of public opinion. People, the leadership is very much afraid of what television is going to show. And therefore, when you get into certain wars, like the Gulf War, in which television is kept out of it, and certain other operations, Grenada, for example, where the press is excluded completely, they're very worried about what impact television will have. And this is a struggle that goes on, in a way, between leadership and the news media, and in a sense, the public, which I think must feel that the news media is doing a service by telling them what's going on.
Television has definitely made wars harder to fight by leaders. And all you have to do is look at the experience at the end of the Gulf War. George Bush himself says that he called a halt to Desert Storm because he was watching images of that trail of devastation, the bombing of those trucks, bodies strewn all over in the desert, that Iraqi retreat from Kuwait being smashed by American air power. It was horrifying, and the horror came into Americans' living rooms. Now, I personally think that it's a damn good thing that television brings that home, because no longer can you fight wars at a distance and visit human devastation on people without seeing the price.
And Vlad, is that going to change the way the Kremlin uses its military?
Well, actually, during the Chechnya war, Moscow media was very much opposed to that war. Unlike the public was indifferent, unfortunately. But the media reported more about the Chechen side, the Chechen casualties, and the Chechen public opinion. I think it had a constraining effect on the ability of the Kremlin, for instance, to carry out covert operations to seize Dudaev or other Chechen leaders, because they learned from Russian media about the intentions of their government.
We'll be back in just a minute with more discussion of how Vietnam changed the way business is done today. Cold War Postscript continues.
Wild speed. What can tame it? What can make it do what you want instead of what it wants? You tame it with a network operating at the speed of light. The ability to send every weather map, tracking satellite image, and forecast for a storm brewing in Texas to a station in Iowa in a fraction of a second. Like we said, that's some wild speed.
Stephanie, it's like your mind is a million miles away.
At Unisys, our people can't stop working on innovative ways to solve our clients' problems.
There's something you want to talk about?
So even now, she's still thinking about a networking solution for a bank in Hong Kong.
Of course.
Because when we set out to do something, we really get into it. Unisys. We eat, sleep, and drink this stuff.
Welcome back to the museum in Arlington, Virginia for more of CNN's Cold War Postscript. How seriously did the United States misread the intentions of China, the Soviet Union, for that matter, Vietnam itself during the war? And has the U.S. learned that lesson? Will we understand any better today what's going on abroad than we did then?
Well, we were driven into Vietnam, propelled into Vietnam by a terrific misperception. We had this notion that communism was a monolith, right? There was some guy sitting at a control panel in Moscow pressing buttons, and communists all over the world were taking orders. A lot of experts in the United States government, in the CIA, in the State Department, in the Defense Department, knew that this was not true, that the Russians and the Chinese had great differences. The Vietnamese hated the Chinese. But the problem always is, how does the information, the intelligence, get up to the policy-making level? And when you get to the policy-making level, they disregarded a lot of that. In fact, the Sino-Soviet split, the split between China and the Soviet Union, doesn't become a reality in policy until Nixon goes to China in 1972.
When it happened at the end of the 1950s.
It happened. You can even trace it back to the 1920s. But the point is that one of the big challenges to making policy and running a government is, how do you use your information? Do you discard it? There are, of course, a lot of other factors when you make policy. There's capital, there's Congress, there's how you felt in the morning when you woke up.
But have we learned the lesson?
Well, I think this is one of the very helpful effects of the end of the Cold War, that policymakers, at least in the United States, are more likely to see local and regional conflicts in their own terms, as opposed to imposing this overall structure of the communist monolith or the Cold War. I think that one of the reasons we so misperceived what happened in Vietnam and in many other countries was because of that overlay. Oh, this is a great global competition. And now we actually have the opportunity to know more and to think much more clearly if we take the opportunity to learn from those mistakes and from that history.
Absolutely agree, because on the Soviet side it was the same thing. They knew about specific ethnographic, cultural, historical facts on that or this terrain, for instance, Afghanistan, before they intervened. But everything was swept aside by one argument, zero-sum game. If we don't go in, Americans might go in. And that reduced the possibility for any minority opinion or for any expert opinion to be heard.
Do you think the Soviets at the time of Vietnam also misread the global nature or the global importance of the Vietnam War, or did they perceive it correctly?
No, they had a pretty good opinion about the global importance of Vietnam War, and the Soviet propaganda used the victory of progressive forces of North Vietnam as in their propaganda, in the international propaganda.
Now, I want to ask you all whether you think an American president today would have the kind of freedom that John Kennedy had, that Lyndon Johnson had, to escalate a military conflict the way it escalated in the 1960s, over 500,000 men, and you know how many billions of dollars were spent. Could that happen again today?
I doubt it. Certainly not within the foreseeable future. I mean, Vietnam has become a part of the American culture. Kids in high school know about Vietnam. They don't know the details, but they know that it was a mistake. People just know that it was an unwinnable war. We got ourselves involved in a situation where we were up against an enemy that was prepared to take unlimited casualties to achieve its goal. People know this now, and they say there is this kind of, to go back to that term, syndrome. I don't like it, but nevertheless, there is this sensitivity. Let's not get involved in these situations. It's too complicated. We don't understand these other cultures.
And in a delayed way, the Vietnamese are now going through that learning process, although clamped down somewhat by the censorship of that still existing communist government. But the burgeoning literature in Vietnam today is anti-war literature, the horrors of war, these phenomenal novels where there is not an Asian disregard for life. They were willing to defend, and they wanted to hold their country. It's an interesting lesson. They still have not worked through that. They still have 300,000 missing in action. It's a country that has a long way to go.
I'm thinking about the myth of invincibility, that it's inherent in any imperial mentality, and the United States passed through this stage at some point. Russia passed through this stage at some point. Germany passed, but now, thanks God, we've
learned that John Wayne exists in the movies, right?
Okay,
and the American imagination.
All right, the devil's advocate question now.
Right.
The United States in the post-Cold War era is supposedly the only remaining superpower. Despite the lessons you've all just talked about, doesn't the U.S. have an obligation beyond U.S. public opinion?
Absolutely, but we don't want to take a Rambo approach to things. We have to examine the situation. Is this the right kind of place to get involved? Where are we going? What's our policy? How are we going to get out? Does the public support it? In other words, before you get involved in a situation today, you have to go through an enormous study of that situation, not just rush in.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for in this edition of Cold War Postscript. Thank you all very much for joining us. Stanley Carno, Tom Blanton, and Vladislav Zubak. In a moment, I'll be back with a closing thought.
Just come naturally. Like natural vitamin E from ADM. Made from the healthy goodness of soybeans, you'll find it in many leading brands of dietary supplements. Studies have shown that natural vitamin E is significantly more effective than synthetic brands, helping you stay healthy in your golden years by maintaining your body's own disease-fighting abilities, while helping you maintain mental sharpness. After all, you're only as old as you feel. And think, it's your health. It's your life. Do what's right for you. Natural vitamin E from ADM. Do what comes naturally.
At Unisys, we don't stop thinking about a client's problem until it's solved. Even now, this guy is developing a system that'll dramatically increase Delta Airlines cargo efficiency.
Are you going to putt or just admire the green?
Solving problems this way isn't unusual for us.
I've got it.
In fact, it's par for the course. Unisys. We eat, sleep, and drink this stuff.
In the time it takes lightning to strike, every book in the Library of Congress can be sent, coast to coast, flawlessly. Quest has harnessed the speed of light. The world is about to become a very different place.
So deeply did the Vietnam experience wound the American people's traditional trust in their government that whenever a president launches a military action, even decades later, critics immediately question White House motives. It's a legacy that seems destined to outlast by many years the disappearance of the Cold War. Now, let's go to our CNN Interactive newsroom. Here's Miles O'Brien.
Tonight on the CNN Interactive Cold War website, we look at the factors and the factions behind the war in Vietnam. Explore the life of Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader who did not live to see his dream of unifying Vietnam fulfilled. You can also examine the career of Henry Kissinger, the U.S. Secretary of State who not only expanded the Vietnam conflict, but helped to end it. The Vietnam era had a tremendous influence on America's popular culture, especially films and television. See for yourself on our interactive TV timeline in the Cold War Culture section. And of course, you're invited to join our live Cold War chat, which begins in just a few moments. All that and more at cnn.com/Cold War.
Thanks for watching this edition of Cold War Postscript. I'm Ralph Begleiter. We'll see you next week.
Now there's more news in the morning with Tara Lynn and Leon Harris on Early Edition, weekdays 7 Eastern on CNN.